Antonio, thanks for being here to kick things off.
Thanks, Steve.
We're honored to have you here representing a Fortune number 5 company with 400,000 employees. So it's a great honor. So as I mentioned, we're coming up on a milestone in diversity, equity, and inclusion this month, the 3rd anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. When that happened, companies, not only around here, but around the country and the world, all made these big commitments to, like, we're going to do better, we're going to do more in advancing DE&I. Not everyone is impressed, though, at how it actually emerged. And I'm wondering, right now, especially with some economic headwinds and things like that, where would you say you've seen progress, and where do you see not so much progress, or at least challenges ahead, obstacles that need to be confronted?
Absolutely. Thanks, Steve, for the question, and welcome all of you. It's a pleasure to be here, honestly. Where I'd say we've seen progress across industries and across organizations is really moving past awareness and moving past some of the traditional kind of training and learning. I think we're starting to get more towards the tactical and strategic planning and really executing against the strategic priorities. When I think about where we were, a number of years ago as a country and as a nation, I think there was a lack of awareness, right? And so we needed to sort of lay the foundation that was necessary for a prominent strategy to be on top of. And now you're starting to see organizations execute against that strategy. The challenges are actually related to that. And I think some of the challenges we continue to see is around the time and the journey that it takes in order to actually achieve progress and sustainable progress. I think our company is not unlike many companies, that we have aspirations to do many things and we want to do them extremely fast. But we also are very intentional about doing it the right way and being very focused on our efforts to ensure that we're bringing all along on our journey and that we're communicating effectively with our stakeholders, with our customers, clients, providers, and saying they're a part of the larger ecosystem. And that it's just as important for us to be internally focused on our efforts as we are externally on efforts. And I think we see that across industries. There's commitments that were made, in response to George Floyd, and some companies were, proactively doing a lot of things that accelerated some of those efforts. And now you're starting to see where organizations are saying, we made really big commitments. How do we actually do it? And so it's taking a little bit more time. And so I think all of us have an appreciation for the journey. And I think it's very important to continue to communicate where we are on the journey, where we are making progress, and how we're making progress, and more importantly, how people can get involved.
Mm-hmm. Do you find, whenever there's historic forward movement on something, progress, there's like a backlash or resistance or whatever you want to call it, but for economic, political, whatever reason, or it's just too much work, So do you see some of that, and how do do you have your radar out for that? Like what's holding us up?
Absolutely. I'd be remiss if I'd said social and political climate didn't impact DEI specifically. Absolutely, there's resistance. But more importantly, that's an opportunity for education, right? And we think about all the folks that are in this room and in the roles that they play or want to play as it relates to people. We start to think about where can we leverage ourselves, leverage our networks to start to influence change. And so when we talk about, resistance that is out there, oftentimes it's centered and focused around a lack of education, a lack of awareness and understanding of others' lived experiences, and especially in populations where that hasn't been their experience. It's very difficult for any of us to say that we can effectively walk in the shoes of someone. Actually, I actually lean towards, I want to understand the shoes that you have walked in versus I actually want to walk in your shoes. And so I think of it in the same way as we think about resistance towards DEI efforts. Some of the things that we've done specifically has been to do a landscape assessment. And I think you see a lot of organizations doing very similar activities to constantly provoke thinking, constantly provoke thought leadership and thought equity around the topics and the very progress that we want to make. How do we continue to say, hey, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this, And your resistors are just as important as those who are advocates for the work, because it actually can pulse on what's the environment. How can you actually navigate through those things? Can't navigate through what you don't know.
Yeah. That's a humble way of looking at it too. It's like, I want to understand what it's like to walk in your shoes rather than presuming to, really know firsthand. So in the last few years, a lot of people in HR and related fields have made DE&I a calling. This is like where I want to go. It's a new and growing area, certainly growing. Could you tell us about your path to the role, which was not linear? It was like you had a lot of different experiences.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, my path is non-traditional. I came from business. I think you mentioned in your opening, I came from banking and finance. And throughout my journey, I understood something very early on that I didn't know that I had a passion for, that ultimately became the anchoring point for me to move towards diversity, equity, inclusion, and that was a center focus on people. In finance and banking, I leaned very heavily outside of my kind of traditional day-to-day of, leading large sales team or operations teams to how do we connect finance to the community, particularly around financial literacy. And I think that was like sort of my start, if you will, to DEI. And then when I was pursuing my MBA, I made the move to UnitedHealth Group and saw an even larger calling around healthcare and connecting healthcare more deeply with the community. I grew up personally not knowing as much about healthcare as I wanted to, as much as and the things that I could take advantage of. And I felt compelled to want to be a part of a solution providing that to the community. All to be said, my journey in marketing, sales, service experience, talent led me towards this place of I enjoy being hyper-focused on people and helping them achieve whatever personal and professional goals that they want to. And I think that has propelled me into a DEI as a broader to say, how do we actually help organizations become super obsessed about the people that work inside their company and all the people that they serve outside of their company? And I think that's the very calling of DEI practitioners. In fact, I think that's the calling for most human resource professionals as well.
Well, you were ahead of your time with the financial wellness and literacy, and that's a very big topic now, big issue for companies. So at UnitedHealth, which is so vast, what are the philosophical elements that help you do what you do at such big scale, so that you have so many different kinds of jobs, different identities, people could fall through the cracks? How do you manage that?
Yeah, I think, the number one thing is we look at our people first, and we think about that through the lens of human leadership. How are we looking at the whole person as an individual before they are an employee? And I think that has centered even our strategy around DEI. We think about who's actually coming to UnitedHealth Group, who's already at UnitedHealth Group, and how are we contributing to a life for them that they want? And how are we sort of wrapping our arms around them as a whole person and saying, we can focus on you before we can focus on, obviously, the output. Yes, performance absolutely matters at every single organization. Organizations have aspirations to continue to grow. We have aspirations to grow, but you will not get the best out of your people unless you are leveraging the collective power of who they are and what they bring to the table. And then magnify those efforts when you start to put them in teams. And so I like to think of this concept around, people come into organizations and they join and they join groups, right? They don't become an effective team until they're being leveraged for what their true potential is. That's when you have a team that flourishes, and that's what we're focused on, is looking at the whole individual before they are an employee.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about specific programs that can make that happen. One is sponsorships. You have a very innovative and comprehensive sponsorship program. How does it work, and how is it different from maybe mentorships and some other kinds of programs?
Great question. We're extremely proud of our sponsorship program. We were very intentional to start with our executive leadership as our sponsors for our sponsorship program. And we felt that that was important because we understand the need to build the muscle inside the organization. An organization of our size with 400,000 plus employees takes a tremendous amount of organic and inorganic growth through sponsorship. And that means modeling the behavior, modeling the actual opportunities in order for others to see, I can also be a sponsor. And that's really what our strategy really looks at and looked at from the beginning to say, hey, if we see it from our leaders, and then we start to see it at the next level underneath those leaders, you start to build the capability, and then it starts to just transcend through the organization. And from the aspect of what's sponsorship versus mentorship, sponsorship really leans towards advocacy, and I know we'll discuss that. But one of the things that differentiates mentorship from sponsorship is someone's ability to actually speak on your behalf in a room, to be able to speak on your character, your work, your ability to succeed, your ability to learn, your ability to ascend to the next level. Oftentimes, mentor relationships offer a lot of advice, career navigation, enterprise navigation, which are all helpful. But what's really important in the moments that matter is someone who can actually speak on your behalf. And that's where sponsorship can be incredibly powerful. You've seen a lot of the large organizations across the world index on sponsorship because they know it's the keys to unlock the kingdom pertaining to diverse talent as they would like to aspire in their career. We've seen it. Other organizations have also seen it. There's wonderful studies out there that show the impacts of sponsorship versus mentorship in their relationship that is important, but start to progress towards more sponsorship than just mentorship. At UnitedHealth Group, we often sort of share this philosophy around building your personal board of directors, right? That's inclusive of a resistor, a coach, a mentor, a sponsor, and also a peer, someone who can provide you feedback on an ongoing basis that can let you know how you're being seen in meetings, how you're being seen in the organization, your work product, et cetera.
Real teammate. Well, it's really evolved, sponsorship. I remember like decades ago, I had a kind of a mentor in a magazine. He was an editor, I was a writer, and he would give me literally advice in Latin. And that was that old school. We were both Catholic, and I would have to go back and like look it up and figure out, what did he just tell me? But so things have progressed so much since then. Now, you touched on the difference between advocacy and allyship. These are terms that we hear more and more. The subtle difference?
Yes. I think of allyship as support. And I think we all have an appreciation. Support can show up in many different ways. Sometimes it's voiceless. Advocacy is not voiceless. Advocacy is front-facing. It's often when you are not in the room. It is, when you are out searching and fighting for the rights of individuals who, and oftentimes of identities that you do not belong to. When we think about allyship, it's you have support for this group. You will stand with this group. But will you stand with this group on your own? That's when you are being an advocate versus an ally.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One thing I want to ask about too is in very large organizations, what can you do to make sure people don't fail to be included because they don't fit into the neat basic categories of identities? They may have intersectional identities, they may be neurodiverse or people with disabilities. How do you get so adept or dexterous or whatever the term might be at being able to include all those people?
Yeah, I think one is being very intentional in your efforts. I think about our employee resource groups. Very powerful for most organizations to have employee resource groups that represent the broad demographics at large. One thing, though, is if you continue and be intentional about bringing those groups together to demonstrate intersectionality, you start to find where those synergies are. And you start to see things like generational diversity, neurodiversity, persons with disabilities in other communities. And that's where the power is. And at UnitedHealth Group, we do a fantastic job of highlighting those moments, because it's really important not only for those moments to exist, but for other people to actually see that those moments exist. That's where you start to index on intersectionality and start to have that be a core process or a core part of your strategy.
Now that we're on campus, it reminds me a little bit of college, like in terms of ERGs. There's on colleges so many groups, affinity groups, where you can find your identity, find people who share it, and as part of your overall campus experience or now work experience. Now, one thing I want to ask about too is internal mobility. So in times of business disruption, how can you help workers adapt to a kind of a changing environment so that they can make a career transition with whatever they might need, reskilling or just finding, oh, there's an opportunity over in this other department?
Yeah, I think about that through our talent management process and life cycle. We have to build, and I think COVID taught us all this as HR professionals, we have to build strategies now that are flexible and adaptable and agile in nature, where we can quickly pivot when something, or if and or when something comes forward. And I think our DEI strategy is very much that way as well. It's forward thinking about what could come, how do we respond in those scenarios in which you can have a strategy that says an employee today has been a part of a group that is changing, and their role and responsibility needs to shift. How do we support them from a learning and development perspective? How do we support them to upskill them with the right tools and capabilities to flex into another role? Look at myself. I went from business operations to talent management to now centered and focused on DEI, community engagement, and social impact, things I wouldn't have never imagined that I've done. And that was made possible because the organization wrapped its arms around me and saw me for more than just the current role that I was in. And so I think as HR professionals, it's really important to start to think of not just this person who's maybe in customer service or in an operations focused role, but is this person a leader? Do they have demonstrated leadership capabilities? How are you supporting them from a growth and development? What's their aptitude to learn? Things that you can start to upskill and actually center and focus on what they're interested in. Because I think what we'll find with a lot of our employees is that there's an opportunity to tap into more passion areas where they will come to work and actually do more once you actually can tap that place that's extremely special to them.
Well, you must have demonstrated that sense of curiosity that your managers or fellow executives responded to. So you need both, right? And people need to be agents of their own growth and have an environment where they can do that. We have just a couple minutes left. Now, in your role in such a big company and in a prominent role, you've had the opportunity to compare notes with some people in some very other large companies like Melanie Parker, who's head of diversity and inclusion at Google. Is there an example or two you could share of what you've learned from this high-level networking that you can do?
Yeah, I would say focusing, specifically on DEI, it's bringing DEI to the local level. And what that really means is integrating DEI into business, right? And actually talking about DEI through the lens of business growth and business trajectory. You think about, for us at UnitedHealth Group, one of the moments that we're extremely proud of is last June we made a commitment, $100 million commitment to diversity in our healthcare workforce, future thinking about the needs of our patients and providers and those that we serve. When we think about that 10-year commitment, it's one of the things that, I think we have learned from other industries about when you put a plan out there and you start to think about what are the needs of an ever-changing environment and future needs, not addressing just what's here. You start to find those ways that say, not only is this good for business, but it's also achieving our DEI aspirations. And our 10-year commitment is a clear example of that. We want to diversify the healthcare workforce, but we're future thinking about where the business is going and how we're getting there.
Mm-hmm. In the 6 seconds that we have, no, you can take a little more than that. But do you have any advice for our HR and DEI leaders in the audience? Just a word or two of advice in terms of how they can overcome challenges too.
I say stay steadfast. You know, our work is often hard work, but it's also heart work. And it's in each of us to continue to show up for our organizations and represent our people and all people and be the voice of what sometimes feels like voiceless, and start to anchor on and challenge status quo where possible and start to index on the opportunities and bring those forward. I think we're at a point in history and in most of our organizations where there is an appetite for change. I think there are conversations happening at the most senior levels of organizations that weren't happening years ago. I actually think that's another large success of where we are today. And I think also you're starting to see momentum towards progress, towards change versus a resistance to change, right? And I think it's within all of us to understand, how do we tell that story? How do we tell that story in the most effective way that it hits home for the individual that you're sitting in front of? So understanding your audience, staying steadfast and recognizing that not every day is gonna be as easy as the last, but you know that what you're doing is contributing to something greater.
Okay, well, so persist, right?
That's right.
Well, thank you. Congratulations on your work, Antonio, and thank you so much for being here and sharing with us.
Absolutely, thank you.